and thanks for joining us on the newspaper review on Nigerian Uprise TV. My name is Chiwando Osisiago. Today we will be analyzing different headlines for different newspapers for the 31st of July 2023. The Daily Trust newspaper. Coupists seek Russia's help as ECOWAS moves military action. Clash imminent as regional body orders border closure, no-fly zone. Chief of Defense Staff asked to act. French embassy attacked. US considers cutting up ties. Military intervention will be catastrophic. Experts. You can find a story on page 4 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Troops deployed in states as Nema warehouse looted in Adamawa. Fintiri declares curfew as 4 hoodlums killed, 80 arrested. States yet to receive grains 10 days after Tinubu's directive. You can find a story on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. 1 killed, several shops burnt as Imo government demolishes Hausa settlement. You can find a story on page 3 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Air connectivity worsen on northern route, fares skyrockets. You can find a story on page 23 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Fuel price hike. State strategize ahead Labour's protest strike. You can find the story on page 35 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And for many more information, you can get on the Daily Trust newspaper. The Guardian newspaper for today. Economy, rule of law, foreign policy, security top agenda for nominees. Key expectations from Tinubu's government and cabinet. Addressing security challenges, foreign policy, economic revamp and poverty reduction, respect for rule of law. You can find the story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Niger coup leaders warn ECOWAS as Commission imposes sanction. You can find a story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Native doctor pays 350 naira ransom, recounts kidnapper killing of 20. You can find a story on page 8. Tinubu commends AIG Foundation for Civil Service Development. You can find it on page 9 of the Guardian newspaper. Unemployment concerns as 7 firms lose 624 billion naira to naira depreciation. You can find a story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. NLC mobilizes meets civil society ahead of Wednesday action. You can find a story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Anti-corruption, Tinubu appoints special investigator, probes CBN related entities. Presidential Tribunal, INEC, Tinubu, Atiku, Obi to adopt final addresses tomorrow. You can find this story on page 3 and page 4 of the Guardian newspaper. And on the Business Day newspaper for today, EIU says Naira crossing 1,000 per dollar on rising inflation. You can find a story on page 37 of Business Day newspaper. First Bank virtual AGM set to be battlefield of gladiators. You can find the story on page 39 of Business Day newspaper. Tinubu launches AIG Imokwede Foundation's 41 million naira fund for civil servants. You can find the story on page 35 of Business Day newspaper. Jackpot wave rising 10 rents take toll on school business. The story is on page 38 of Business Day newspaper. Court halt power calm takeover of Kano Disco. You can find this story on page 32 of Business Day newspaper. And lastly, the big story, Abuja, beautiful city tainted by poor transport system. You can find this story on page 2 on Business Day newspaper. This day newspaper. ECOWAS orders Niger Junta to reinstate ousted president in 1 week or be forced out. You can find a story on page 5 of this day newspaper. Atiku Flay Economics Intelligence Unit prediction in 2023 presidential election. You can find a story on page 5 of this day newspaper. As 100 Naira arbitrage emerges in FX market, ERU predicts return to dual exchange rate before year end. You can find the story on page 5 of this day newspaper. Double honors for Zenith at London Stock Exchange as bank retains 2 awards. This story is also on page 5 of this day newspaper. Daily Sun newspaper for today. NLC adamant on mass action strike. Says no going back on August 2 date. Dispatches officials to zones for final mobilization. Kalu others plead for suspension of action. This story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Finally, DSS allows Nnamdi Kanu access to private doctor. Coalition of Biafra groups backs IPOP leader on order to end sit at home. You can find a story on page 4 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Northern group calls for protest over hunger in region. You can find a story on page 6 of the Sun newspaper. ECOWAS gives Niger Republic coups 1 week to reinstate Bazoum as president, may use force. You can find this on page 29 of the Sun newspaper. Polls. Court fixes tomorrow for adoption in Atiku Obi's petition against Tinubu INEC. You can find this on page 29 of the Sun newspaper. Tinubu appoints special investigator to probe CBN amid Emefiole's trial. You can find a story on page 25 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And lastly, LP faults choice of minister, says Nigeria deserves better than recycled forces, vows to challenge submission of incomplete list. You can find a story on page 27 of the Sun newspaper. And the Punch newspaper for today. Uncover CBN, NNPCL mess. Economists tell Tinubu special investigator. Tinubu appoints Obazi special investigator, EFCC others to join probe. Investigator to go after ex-Buhari's appointees, private individuals hiding government fund. You can find the story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. NLC insists on Wednesday strike mobilizing worker. You can find the story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. Kanu returns to DSS custody after checkup by personal doctor. You can check the story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. 15 ministerial nominees submit credentials ahead of screening. You can check the story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. Niger coup plotters dismiss ECOWAS threat. Bazoum reinstatement. You can find the story on page 14 of the Punch newspaper. NDLEA nabs Lagos nightclub drug suppliers. Government warns operators. You can find the story on page 5 and page 6 of the Punch newspaper. Operation Flush. 88 robberies suspect arrested in Lagos. Damn dull continues. You can find the story on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Over 2,000 Nigerian girls stranded in Mali, Napti. You can find the story on page 11 of the Punch newspaper. And that's the much we have for you today on the newspaper review on the Nigerian Uprise TV. My name is Chiwando Osisiago. Do have a wonderful day and thank you for watching.